Today we have the honor of having Ken Disbrow join us. Ken is the co-founder and managing partner of Public Knowledge LLC and has over 25 years of experience consulting with public sector clients in the fields of health, human services, public safety, transportation, and employment. After studying psychology in undergraduate and graduate school, he worked in both technical and management positions, including 5 years at one of the Big Five management consulting firms. Ken left this firm to co-found Public Knowledge LLC. His experience includes organizational design, assessment and change management, and the justification, specification, procurement, development, and implementation of information systems. Most of his current work focuses on independent verification and validation and quality assurance. So welcome, Ken, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Deb.
Yeah, so we're going to discuss predictive project management in the context of comparing it to other project management frameworks such as Agile. And I would also like to let our audience know that your organization has developed a methodology called Predictive Management. So can you describe your definition of predictive project management for us?
Yeah, maybe a little historical context is important here. When I first started managing projects and working with projects, there weren't really any formal management methodologies. At the time, the Project Management Institute and their PMBOK approach was probably in version 1, so there was some certainly the beginnings of things, but there were a number of shortcomings with that approach, as there remain to this day. And one of the things we sort of realized as we began to look at things, and you got to understand my background in psychology, a lot of it is as a statistician for psychology. So I recognized that there was a lot of data being collected about projects, but it was sort of being used the wrong way. And by that I mean most data on projects historical data on projects is used to place blame. So, back at this day, you didn't get this done, or this didn't happen, or that sort of a thing. We recognized pretty early on you could use this historical data to build predictive models of the behavior of a project. So based on your historical performance or throughput for a project, you can kind of predict you can very accurately predict when a project will be done, or a segment of a project, or a piece of a project. There are some other techniques, and I'll talk about them in a few minutes, that we recognized were missing from some of these more standard methodologies, like the Project Management Institute. You may have heard of Prince 2, which is sort of a European project management approach. But this really started as some individual tools to supplement existing project management methodologies. Now, it kind of turned into its own sort of methodology, but I want to emphasize it could still be used either as a complete methodology, and that's probably beyond the scope of time, what we have the time to talk about here today, or it could be used as a supplement to other project management methodologies to this day. So again, it started out as a supplement to some existing methodologies, and it kind of grew to the point that it holds all sorts of things. What it doesn't have are things that are in other existing methodologies, so things like earned value management, some of your students may know about, things like that are pretty well understood and known. What we do have are a lot of tools and techniques that are kind of unique to this, that we think at least supplement, and again, taken together, they can be viewed as an entire project management methodology. I'll spend just maybe a little bit more time talking about kind of what those tools are, which will give people, I think, get to the point of answering your question about how I describe them, the approach here. So one of the key things is kind of splitting some roles on the project. Very typically, you have a project manager who controls everything. They say, we're going to do this, this, and this, and we'll get it done by this date, and that sort of a thing. Under predictive management, you really split that into two roles. One is the buyer of the product that you're producing, and the other is the manager, sort of the seller of the product. We do that very simply because we kind of view project management as an economic model. You're delivering something and you're selling it to somebody. In an organization, that could be a vice president, or somebody has to act as the sponsor. Somebody has to take responsibility for buying a product. Somebody else is responsible for delivering that product, which is typically the manager. But we want to separate those two because it takes burden off of the project manager, when somebody asks for a feature, the manager can say, well, you know what, I have to ask the sponsor if we can afford that, or if he wants that or she wants that. So that's a big piece of it, is splitting that. Another piece, as I mentioned, a lot of times project management methodologies focus on historical work and think, what did we get done? We focus on what's left, what remains. I don't care what you've gotten done. That really doesn't matter. In the long run, it doesn't matter, because it's what's left that matters. How much work do you have left to do? It's great to look back at the end of the day and see you've checked off your to-do list, but probably what's more important at the end of the day is what you have to do in the future. So that's another big piece, is focusing on the remaining work. The historical work is used only in context to predict how fast you'll get through that remaining work. The next piece we do is what we call targeting, which is really providing individual assignments to people based on that remaining work. You chunk it out into reasonable bites and plan what you can do in the next very short period. And this is a little similar to Agile, although, well, I'll get into the differences in a little bit. But basically what we do is you sit down as a project manager with each individual working for you and say, okay, what do you plan to get done? What hasn't been done completed? What do you plan to get done in this week? What do you need from me to make that happen? And then the following week you go and you ask, well, did you get what you thought done? And if the answer is no, you don't beat the people up. You say, okay, well, what could we have done differently? Did you bite off more than you could chew? Do you need to have, better equipment, better tools? What can I do as a manager to help you? And thus the role of the manager becomes more a facilitation rather than holding a whip or something over somebody. Another piece of this is to provide the big picture regularly to the whole team. And one of the things often you'll hear in projects is that people don't know what's going on. We have things we generally call them synchronization meetings, or sync meetings for short, wherein everybody's together. This could be virtually or in person, and we all get together and walk through the big issues of a project, again, sort of on a weekly basis like we do with targeting, although targeting is a one-on-one between you and I about the work you have to do. Synchronization is all of us get in the room and say, here's where we are, here's what we know, here's where we share information. Another piece of this is continuous scope management. So, and this is where this differs a little from Agile. In Agile, you'll do a sprint. You'll say, okay, we're going to get, here's what we're going to do in the next 6 weeks, or in this sprint, or the next 4 weeks, or 3 weeks, however long your sprint is. In predictive management, scope can grow and shrink based on the willingness of the sponsor to pay the price. So as an example, I'm a user, I have a new feature that I'd really like to see. We're in the middle of what you traditionally call a sprint in Agile. And I go to the project manager and say, hey, for this release to be really useful to me, I need feature X. And what the manager would do then, because he or she should say, gee, I don't have the authority to approve this, but I will take it to the sponsor. And what the manager does is sit down with his team and say, how much will this cost, either in terms of dollars or money or other features that would have to be removed if you want to stay on it in the same timeline. Take it to the sponsor, who will say yay or nay on that. And if they say yay, it goes back into the process. But the point is, this can happen at any time. It can be a little disruptive. Sometimes it takes a lot to get particularly developers sort of used to this. But, we find it works really well. Eventually, the projects will get into a rhythm where they'll say, okay, the sponsor will say, no, we don't want to do it now. We'll put it on the list. And again, the last piece of this, the last component, is to predict schedule and budget regularly, and I mean weekly, where you go through and say, okay, based on the work we have, our historical throughput, and the work that's come in this week, this is when we think we'll be done, and this is what the cost is. That way, at any point when some user or person comes to the manager and says, I'd like to have X, Y, and Z, you can very clearly and incrementally show the sponsor what it'll cost. And to add that feature in, that's part of the job of the manager, is he figures that out, goes to the sponsor and says, if we do this, here's the cost to you. Are you willing to pay it? So again, the manager doesn't take the responsibility for controlling the scope. It's the sponsor. Anyway, that in a nutshell is an overview of what it is. There's a lot more nuances again, this is probably, we've done some courses in the past that generally take 2 to 3 weeks to complete to kind of understand the full methodology. But those 6 principles I mentioned, sort of splitting the sponsor, the focus on remaining work, targeting work with people, kind of providing the big picture regularly, continuous scope management, and predicting schedule and budget regularly are kind of the core of the process. And believe it or not, these are missing from a lot of the methodologies, the PMI and the prints and those sorts of things, which deal more with mechanics rather than, sort of the pragmatics of a project.
That's great. Thank you. So I did hear you mention Agile several times, and some people think that Agile is the best way to manage technology projects. Do you agree with that?
So in my spare time, I do a lot of woodworking. I don't only have a hammer in my toolkit. and obviously the analogy there is simply the more arrows you have in your quiver or tools in your toolbox, the better you can be a craftsman. I think, remember now, Agile was originally a software development methodology. If your students don't know that, go Google the Agile Manifesto. A guy named Kent Beck and Ward Cunningham, people who I've had some exposure to and experience with, came up with this concept of an Agile Manifesto. And it was originally a software development approach and almost a philosophy, to be honest, rather than a project management methodology. People have slapped, it's a great silver bullet. People have slapped Agile on a number of things. I've seen Agile done on projects 10 years ago I would have called waterfall in their model. So Agile in and of itself is a very vague term. Probably the most popular Agile approach is the Scrum that I mentioned, where let's get a defined scope and say we'll do in 4 weeks we'll get this piece of work done, and you go through a mini development process where you do some form of design, some coding, some testing, and you put out a minimal product, and the next time you build on that, and build on that, and build on that. So I don't agree it's the best. It is a tool like anything else. A good craftsman has a number of tools in their toolbox, and Agile itself is very broad and vague. So just saying Agile is the best is, a little like motherhood and apple pie sort of thing. It's kind of meaningless. Yeah, we all like apple pie, but there's other kinds of pie, and you should be aware of them. So I hope that kind of answers your question. I don't think any professional should just have a single tool in their toolbox. And most of the Scrum-like approaches to project management are a single tool. So
right.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's great. Did answer my question. And so, is there certain instances where it's better to use the traditional style methodology of project management?
So again, this sort of gets to the concept of what's right for the situation you're in. And I'll give you an example. Our predictive management tools, let me talk about those a little bit.
Okay.
If I were doing a 2-week project, other than the targeting piece that I mentioned, I probably would not use the rest of it. It doesn't make a lot of sense. If I had a project I thought was going to last about 2 weeks, it doesn't make a lot of sense for me to regularly predict schedule. I mean, even if I'm off by a week, if I'm off by 50%, it's probably not a big deal. If, on the other hand, I was doing a 1-year project or a 2-year project, I would want to know if I was off by 50% on that, because it'll make a difference. Maybe I'll pull the project. Maybe it'll get too expensive. So sort of, back to your question, I think every methodology and approach has appropriate situations in which you can apply them. I think the most important piece about having a methodological approach is simply that you have some discipline and a place to go, to go and look, and some tools that are hopefully based on people's experience that you can utilize in your project to make it improve the odds of delivery. So I don't think you have to look at each project. Again, you have to have a broad understanding of the methodologies, understand how to apply them in order to make it work. There are many projects, and in this day and age, Agile is generally designed as a software development methodology. In this day and age, very often you're installing a commercial off-the-shelf or COTS piece of software. So Agile kind of applies, but kind of doesn't, where it's a little more of a big bang. We're going to put in, a trivial example would be a new accounting system. where odds are you're going to put in some significant pieces of it all at once. Or if you're going to install Microsoft Word on everybody's machine, you're going to do it all at once. Now, you may train incrementally or something like that, but the actual installation of the software happens all at once. There are probably better management methodologies. There are better management methodologies for those kinds of projects than there are than Agile. So again, it sort of depends on the approach that you're going to use.
Right, and a lot of those are already defined up front, most of the scope. So, yeah. So what do you see some of the major problems or issues with predictive project management?
So in this case, honestly, it's people aren't disciplined enough to use it. And that's true of any management methodology.
Right.
It's hard. It really is hard to be sort of thorough and kind of, how do I say it? It almost becomes rote and boring at a point to every week sit down with someone and say, okay, what do you plan to accomplish this week? You didn't finish these 2 things. Those are important because in our group meeting, we decided we need to finish feature X, and those 2 things are on the critical path to getting feature X done. It really does become a bit rote and boring, and people don't like that. So the biggest problem is having the discipline to actually, kind of perform or keep the methodology up and keep it going. I'm just going to take a quick peek at my notes here, see what else. Yeah, I guess that's about it. People won't use it consistently because it's hard to be consistent about things.
And yeah, I mean, emergencies come up and things like that, right?
It happens in any project, in any methodology. There's always something that happens. Some generally outside influence of some kind hits a project, could be a director in an agency or a director in a business says, I don't like that, I want this instead. And sometimes we're all, as project managers, sort of at the whims of politics and whatever other things going on in the organization.
Great. And so my last question is, over the years, what kind of changes have you seen in the way projects are being managed, specifically IT projects?
So I've seen projects go from being very informal in their management. To the point it was really seat of the pants sort of thing, and management by wandering around was a big phrase, probably 15 years ago, where people thought that was actually managing. I'll just go talk to people and say, hey, how's it going? And people would say, oh, I'm doing great. I'm 80% done with my work, which is kind of meaningless if you think about it, because you don't know, and particularly if nobody's ever taken the time to figure out what 100% of the work is. You don't know what 80% means. You don't have any idea how this individual predicted it's 80% done. So I've seen that it go from sort of that seat of the pants to almost, in my mind, too formal, where we now have all these certifications I'm certified to manage a project. I'm a certified Scrum Master. I'm a certified this, certified that, which really says little about the techniques they'll use or effectiveness of the project manager. I've also seen, in some ways, a return to that in software development itself, and I was a software developer at one time. I've seen Agile used as an excuse to not be disciplined about designing software, and the same with management. I've seen it used as, well, we're Agile, meaning we change by the minute and things like that. That's not what management is in general, and that's not what project management is. So I've seen 2 things. I've seen a shift in a lot of places to being very formal, almost too formal, that, well, you don't have this certification, so you can't do that. Which, for me personally, when I go to hire people, I would rather they understand predictive management, because it is based on kind of behavioral analysis and best behaviors to make a project successful, than have a PMP, which is a bit academic in nature. It doesn't mean they're a bad manager if they have a PMP, but if that's all they know, it can lead to some trouble. Now, my customers, on the other hand, often think a PMP is, the de facto standard for managing a project. So many of my people do, and we encourage people to get PMP. We encourage our people to get PMPs. But in reality, and pragmatically, the PMP doesn't always mean you know how to manage a project. And that's sort of what predictive management does. is kind of, if you can do those things, you are in fact managing a project. It's about the behavior of a manager rather than the sort of things they should check off on their list. So those are sort of the changes I've seen over the last 20 years in project management. Went from no formality to probably too much, and now we're starting to see some things, particularly on the name of Agile, which really means back to seat of the pants management, which it shouldn't, because Agile management is not seat of the pants management. It's just an excuse a lot of people use to not have to apply any discipline to their project management.
Thank you so much, Ken. Your experience has been very valuable for us. Great to have you here. Thank you.